Good morning, everyone. I'm Kay Jacobson, the History Coordinator and Current Affairs Coordinator for Online Programming for Ramsey County Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Great Decisions, where today we'll be hearing from Jay Shahidi on the High Seas Treaty. Jay was born in Tehran, Iran, long ago. We didn't ask for the actual date, but he moved to Minnesota 56 years ago and eventually became a US citizen. He majored in political science and economics and has a degree from the University of Mankato, where he later won the Humanitarian Award as an alumni. Jay speaks on, he's an international affairs researcher, advocate, and speaker, and has been a past president of the United Nations Association of Minnesota Division, worked with Amnesty International, and has been with Great Decisions for over 20 years, speaking on all topics for Global Minnesota and the Foreign Policy Association. So we're very happy that he's going to be with us here today speaking. Okay, with all of that, I'm going to hand things over to Jay, who's going to unmute. There you go, Jay.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank you, Kay Jacobson, and your IT expert, Grayson Simmons, for getting me over here and organizing this program. And I'm also thankful to Dr. Kate Schaefers from University of Minnesota, Usher Life Learning Institute for scheduling me with you. But more than anything, I'm very thankful to the leaders and staff at Global Minnesota for scheduling me to do these discussion courses for about 20 years now. And it's been a great pleasure for me to research and study. As you know, they partner with Foreign Policy Association in New York. And every year, 8 topics of international concern to the American people are chosen. And in this past year, one of those topics is the High Seas Treaty of the United Nations. And as an advocate of the United Nations and international cooperation, that's right up my alley. I've spent about 50-some years of my life trying to figure out how we could cooperate as countries and solve our international problems like pandemics, climate change, pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I am here. Before we go any further, I'd like to start with a question to the listeners and everyone. Who owns America? Who owns the United States of America? I suppose most of you will answer people. The American people own the land that belongs to the United States of America. And the people of Russia, technically and by international law, own Russia, regardless who is running that government, whether they are more autocratic or dictatorial or democratic. And that's true with all the countries of the world. And according to the latest figures, we have about 195 countries. 193 are members of the United Nations. That means almost all of them. And the other 2 who are not members of the United Nations are not really, have not been able to prove that they are independent countries, or because of some reasons they want to stay independent. Now, let me get back to that question. And before that, I'd like to start this whole presentation by asking Grayson to show a video for a few minutes, which is really a summary of what we are going to get into in more detail.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. Delegates at the United Nations have agreed on a historic international treaty to protect biodiversity in the ocean. It's been years in the making and only made it over the finish line after a marathon 36-hour negotiating session that ended late last night. Even for people who don't live near it, the ocean is central to life on Earth. It covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, is home to tens of thousands of fish species, provides oxygen for the planet, and provides the livelihood for billions of people. But only 1.2% of the ocean has any legal protection, leaving the high seas lawless and ripe for exploitation. Overfishing threatens biodiversity. Another threat, the ocean's rising temperatures caused in part by climate change. And the man-made scourge of plastic pollution poses an ever-growing problem. Late last month, as the United Nations kicked off a fifth round of negotiations to establish a treaty to protect more of the ocean, the cause gained some star power.
We depend on the ocean. You know, even dogs don't poop in their kennel because they know that the kennel provides security and a home for them. We're pooping in our kennel. We're supposed to be so smart. We're destroying things we don't even understand.
The outcome is critical to reaching another UN goal, protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030. Over the past 2 weeks, delegates from 193 countries met to try to hammer out the final details of a treaty. Among the goals, creating a legal framework to establish a network of high-sea marine protected areas, creating rules for exploitation of resources, and confronting the issue of overfishing.
The ship has reached the shore.
Late last night, after 36 straight hours of negotiation at the United Nations, the president of the conference announced the historic agreement. Earlier, I spoke with Liz Cairn, who was at the UN for those negotiations, as head of the Pew Charitable Trust efforts to protect ocean life on the high seas. I asked her about the final push to get the deal done.
It was truly incredible. The negotiations started even before the official starting time of 10 a.m. on Friday morning and went all through the night into the next morning and didn't conclude till almost 10 p.m. the next day. So, it's not unusual for negotiations of this kind to go into a little bit of overtime, but this was really an incredible situation where I think because of the complexity of the package of issues being dealt with, negotiators really needed that extra time to push it over the finish line.
Given the complexity, given how long this has been in the works and how long these final round of talks were, how much of the significance of this agreement is in the details of the provisions, and how much is it the fact that it exists, that countries were able to come to an agreement at all?
Given where the situation in the world today, I think that it's historic that we are able to have a multilateral agreement of this scale that covers the high seas, which covers 2/3 of the world's ocean. It is also an incredibly detailed agreement. It sets out a legal framework for establishing high seas marine protected areas and other area-based management tools. It sets out standards and a consistent process to evaluate environmental impacts of new activities in the high seas. And it also sets out financial benefit sharing for derived from marine genetic resources. And a very important element is it ensures capacity building and the transfer of marine technology to ensure the equitable and effective implementation of this agreement.
What were the final hurdles or some of the toughest hurdles to clear before the agreement was reached?
I think two key issues. One is around that financial benefit sharing of the marine genetic resources. It really is an unprecedented provision and basically ensures that benefits that are derived from the global commons are shared shared globally. So what that means is that developing countries can also benefit from them, and that those benefits will be in turn used for the conservation and sustainable use of the marine environment.
So it sounds like it's some of the same splits that we've seen in climate change talks between the rich industrial nations and the poor nations, who feel that they're being asked to pay for what the rich industrial nations have created, but now they're looking to get the benefits. Is that right?
That's true. Yes, I think financial benefit sharing is an important issue. It really is an issue of equity and allowing for the effective implementation of the agreement. The agreement will, as I mentioned, set out a process for the establishment of large-scale marine protected areas in the high seas, and that is really important to protect areas that are going to be key for biodiversity, especially in a changing climate.
Now, this still has to be ratified by many of the signatory nations. Is that right?
It does. Actually, what occurred last night is that the president of the conference finalized the text that will then be going for technical review and translation into all 6 UN official languages, at which time countries will come back and officially adopt it in the near future.
And what's next? I mean, I know that the UN would like to have rules governing 30% of the oceans by 2030. Does this help that?
Absolutely. The high seas make up 2/3 of the world's oceans. It's over half of the surface area of the planet. And they play a very important role in ensuring the implementation of the 30 by 30 target. Actually, without this treaty, it would be very hard to meet that target.
Liz Karen of the Pew Charitable Trust, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Well, I would like to go and further explain the points you just heard in that video. And let me tell you, people who are listening, that I practically watched dozens of documentaries and news videos and audios and read articles, probably dozens of them in the last year regarding this, in the last 2 years regarding this issue. And this documentary to me was very concise and it referred to all the major points. So I take it, after listening to what was just said on public television, now you understand that the oceans of the world, or as internationally defined by high seas, or which all the oceans are basically included in the high seas. Of course, part of the oceans belong to the territory of each country, each independent country, and we'll get into that. However, going back to the question I raised, who owns the oceans? Who owns the high seas? The United States doesn't own all of them, neither no country does. So what happens is, who is going to police and clean up and protect the oceans? In the United States, we have a system of jurisprudence, we have laws, we have people who make decisions about protecting this country, but who protects the middle of Indian Ocean? And some of the high seas are even not in the oceans, as we call them, the oceans, but we can call them high seas, which is a more correct term, like, for example, Gulf of Mexico or Caspian Sea between Iran and Russia and some other countries. And these are, Caspian Sea is the largest lake in the world. And so if you look at the world, as was explained in that video, most of the world is covered by water. And you hear anywhere from 71% to 72% of the surface of the world is covered by water. That includes the oceans, the lakes, the seas. And one reason that there is no exact figure for where let's say the surface, a land surface ends and where the water begins, is because we have so many areas. Like if you go to Louisiana, there are vast areas of marshland where part of the year they're flooded and covered with water, part of the year they're more marshland, and that's true about many parts of the world. So it's very hard to decide where, let's say, a land ends and water begins. So that's why there is some discrepancy there. And you hear something like 2/3 of the world is covered by seas and oceans, and sometimes you hear 3/4. But the more exact figure I found is about 72%. Now, look at this map, because I'm going to refer to so many areas of it. I know everybody listening must be interested in world affairs, interested in protecting the environment and the earth. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening on a Friday morning like this. However, I also want to tell you humbly that some of you, I'm sure, have a lot more expertise than I do. Some of you are scientists, environmentalists, professionals who work for the UN, who work for the US State Department or others, and some of you may have less expertise. So please forgive me if I'm too rudimentary at times, or if I get into too much details at times, because I understand that probably a few hundred people are listening right now, and probably more will be listening later on through YouTube and others. Anyway, try to refresh your memory about where all the continents are, North America, Latin America, South America, and Asia, Africa, Oceania. So let's go to the next talking point. As the video indicated, if you look at the world from the North Pole, look at the image on one side of your screen. Again, it's amazing how much water there is. That's why we say, 2/3 or 72%, 71% is water. If you look from the North Pole, that's the photo. Most people look at maps, but from where we are, not from the North Pole. And look at the other one that shows Antarctica, which is the South Pole. And again, there is even more water there. Basically, a lot of it is frozen, because that's how the Earth is. We need those ice formations to control our climate. That's why we have to worry about climate change or global warming, because then a lot of the ice from the North Pole and South Pole is melting. And that's why we need to really reverse the situation and reduce the speed of that melting. Please look at the globe that shows Antarctica, and you'll see a section that says Ross Sea, kind of at the bottom, ROSS, Ross Sea. I'll get back to that later in my talk. So let's go to the next talking point. No, the one that says Blue Planet. Here are the maritime zones, which the United Nations passed a convention, an agreement back in 1982, after almost 30 years of discussion and negotiations, in order to establish maritime zones. Now look at this diagram. As you see, a typical country which is got, let's say, next to water, there are internal waters which are sometimes hard to define, because you look at Florida Keys, is the water between the Florida Keys and mainland of Florida considered internal waters, or are they part of the ocean? Do they belong to the United States? Do they belong to the whole world? And who's in charge of them? Who's protecting them? Who's policing them? These are important questions. So back in 1982, the United Nations defined that about 12 nautical miles of the sea belongs to that country. They're called territorial waters. And 12 nautical miles, it's a little more than regular miles. Actually, from what I remember, a nautical mile is 1.15 nautical mile. But then the United Nations also defined that up to 200 nautical miles are considered exclusive economic zones, where countries can go explore, catch fish, and explore, find minerals in the bottom and dig oil wells. And the situation is that's the exclusive economic zone that countries. And then beyond the 200 nautical miles becomes high seas. So right now, most of the oceans, about 60 to 64% of the oceans of the world are not really under anybody's control. They're like the Wild West. Anybody can go exploit, kill, throw garbage into it, hijack ships, do overfishing, do illegal fishing, etc. So it was important, and there was this agreement was called the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And all presidents and all leaders of the world accepted it. President Reagan back then in 1982, 83, 84 had some objections to the provisions that talked about exploring for minerals at the bottom of the ocean. Not in the territorial waters, but in the international waters, which are high seas. But then that issue was resolved soon. So all the presidents of the United States Navy, the United States Coast Guard, and practically all scientific, environmental, and conservation groups have accepted the provisions of that 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, since then, up to June 4th of 2003, which is about a year and a half ago, there was a discussion going on about what to do next, because the 1982 agreement defined what territorial waters are and the exclusive economic zone is. But what if after that, there was no provision about protecting 60% of the waters of the world? So that's why there was a need to come up with another agreement, another treaty. The first time this agreement was brought, which is called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, or High Seas Treaty, the first time it was really proposed at the UN and international organizations was 1995. So it took almost like 28 years for it to become an agreement. And there were long periods of discussion and maybe about 10 years of really intense negotiations, 5 years of really, really intense negotiations at the international level. The United Nations established the Intergovernmental Panel, whose president, you saw the lady who said the ship has reached the shore Of course, what she meant is finally we've reached an agreement. Can you imagine how difficult that must have been? For example, I don't know, some of you have been to a city council meeting or a school board meeting. Some of you have been at the state legislature or a committee of the state legislature where there are hearings, and you hear so many different views and sometimes very contentious. Can you imagine 193 countries agreeing on anything? That to me is, if I like of a better world, is a miracle, because each of these countries have a different form of government with different interest groups, lobby groups behind that government, different expectations and agendas, and coming to an agreement about protecting the high seas. It's really something historic and something that we should all celebrate. I know there has been some news coverage, but I think most people, not only in the United States, but around the world, still need to hear about it. That's why I'm so thankful to Foreign Policy Association in New York for choosing this subject as a topic. So let me, can we go to the next slide? Okay. Actually, about, as I said, 72% of the Earth's surface are covered with oceans. And out of that, 43% of the Earth's surface are considered to be high seas, because not all the ocean parts of the oceans, as I said, we have territorial waters which belong to that country. But listen to this, that's not that easy. It's easier said than done. What do we do with English Channel between France and Britain? At one point, it's only 19 miles. So how can we have 12 miles for this country and 12 miles that country? So that means they'll have to get together and come to a bilateral agreement, or go to the United Nations and have, if it really gets bad, they go to International Court of Justice and have say, okay, well, you know, who's got the authority? What part of English Channel? But most countries have realized that they'd better get along. So they probably divide that section of English Channel into, you know, half mine, half yours, half belongs to France, half belongs to Britain or United Kingdom. Then when we get to the economic zone, exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles, what do we do with Cuba? Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States. So how can we have 200 miles of it to be under the control of the US and 200 miles of it under the control of Cuba? So many parts of the world have that problem, especially the island nations, which are next to each other, all over the Pacific, all over Indian Ocean and Atlantic. And then there are peninsulas and bays and all that. So nations really will have to get along. And that's one reason we are lucky to have an organization like the United Nations. So the High Seas Treaty is officially called BBNJ, which stands for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And the name says it all, where we got to do something about protecting nature. Protecting the oceans, which is part of our nature. And let me tell you a couple of other things that you may be interested in. Most scientists have found evidence, it's really proven, that 95% of all the living organisms, all the plants, animals, fungi, 95% of all the living organisms live in water. Only 5% live on land, like us and our pets. And when we go to a forest, we think, oh, we have all these insects and all these animals and plants, but the water holds most of them. And let me tell you one other thing. What if you take the surface of the earth, which is, I memorized that, 197 square miles. That's water and land combined. 197 square miles, or about 520 square kilometers. Million, I'm sorry. 197 million square miles. If you take the surface and go down in the water by about 10 feet, there are some animals and plants that live there. You go another 5 or 10 feet, there are another group or species, other species live there. So 96 to 97% of the living organisms live in the water, and 96 to 97% of the living space on the planet of Earth is inside water. And we as humans, we as Americans have gone to other planets. We are going to Mars. We are looking for water in Mars, but we have so much water on Earth and we haven't explored our oceans. And right now, this photo is an example that most scientists have reached the conclusion that there are 2.3 million species of plants and animals, and those in between like fungi and amoeba, bacteria. There are some that do not fit in the category of animals or plants. They live in the water. And so what we want to do to protect them, because the oceans create oxygen for us to breathe. They absorb carbon dioxide. Most of our pollution on land from our industrialization produces CO2, which is really damaging our environment. But that CO2 is absorbed by the especially the planktons, these creatures in the ocean, and oxygen is produced. However, the oceans are also heating from human activity beyond the natural heating, which could be related to the actions, happenings of the sun. Human activities are warming the oceans, and also the acidity in the oceans is increasing, which is harmful to those animals and plants that are helping us. Now, let's put the fishing aside. Probably 1/3 of the population of the world depends on seafood for survival. Basically, all the island nations and communities that are next to the waters, I mean, that's their livelihood. So what we need to do is protect these oceans. And that's the purpose of this Biodiversity Beyond National jurisdiction. And that's what this treaty has decided to concentrate on. And let me tell you that 193 delegations of 193 governments, which are members of the United Nations, agreed on this. The intergovernmental panel, which was a group of experts and environmentalists and scientists and diplomats that actually came out and did all the negotiations, and different individuals, it took like 28 years. But what happens is that all the presidents, prime ministers, kings, all the heads of states have accepted it already. However, there is a process of ratification for the UN. And in the democratic countries, that becomes harder, because in the democratic countries, we have, let's say in the United States, a Congress, which is made up of two houses of Senate and House of Representatives. And a United Nations treaty has to be ratified by them. It's not just the President of the United States. Right now, all heads of states have signed it in New York, June of last year. And but the agreement was reached that by June of 2025, it should be ratified by 60 countries. And as of now, the latest figure I have from September, only 13 countries have that. Yeah. So what we need to do is really advocate for the ratification of this treaty at the US Congress. And that's why I'm interested to be here to talk to you. Mind you, the treaty that was signed back in 1982, which, as I said, all the presidents of the United States have supported it, still has not been ratified by US Congress, because there is a group of senators who are against it because they don't like the UN. They think the UN takes some of the power away from the US government or the United States. On the other hand, look at it. Who's going to protect the oceans and all the living organisms? Who's going to prevent another government, a smuggler, to come and do what I call, trawl fishing, or I call the sweep fishing, where they come, these ships come. Let's go to the next photo. These fish come with, let's go to the next one. This is just like an example of marine life. Oh, look at the pollution. I mean, plastics. There is an article in July 15 of Time magazine. I really like you to read it. It's only 6 pages. July 15, 2024, Time magazine. It has an article about plastic pollution. Do you know plastic from India, Africa, and the United States are found in Seychelles Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? So what are we going to do? Who's going to prevent that? Who's going to prevent the criminals from taking garbage to the high seas and dumping it overnight for profit? Let's go to the next photo. And this is the example of what I call trawl fishing or sweep fishing. There are these giant ships that go and just sweep the fish for 100 feet, 50 feet, 40 feet below water. And that includes all the larvae, that includes all the eggs. They basically are damaging. Now, in Minnesota, in every state, we have fishing season. That means the governments say, okay, certain times of the year when the fish are laying eggs, or you can't do this. But on the high seas, which is 60% of the surface of the world, and the high seas that create most of the oxygen, most of the food, and so much of our medicine comes from the genetic materials from the oceans. Nobody's protecting them. So it's about time we do that. Let's go to the next photo, please, quickly. This is an example of what I call illegal fishing, where ships go and they turn off their transponder and nobody knows where they are. So these are the things that this treaty intends to do. And I really urge you to look at it more carefully. Go online and put high seas treaty, and you get plenty of information, short videos, long videos, and written articles. And let's go to the next photo. And oh yeah, this is an example of seeking for minerals. Now, the bottom of the ocean is full of minerals of all kinds. There are the hydrothermal vents. There are polymetallic nodules. There are all kinds of minerals that are found there, you know, copper, zinc, nickel. So we need those. So somebody's got to regulate it. Somebody's got to police it so criminals don't get there and rip it off. Can you imagine if President Theodore Roosevelt, 100 and some years ago, can you imagine if he hadn't established the national parks and national forests? Can you imagine? Probably we wouldn't have too much forest left in the United States. So, but right now, nobody's doing that about the high seas. So we need to do that, and we need an international organization, and nobody's more qualified and all-encompassing than the United Nations. So for our own sake, for America's sake, for the interests of American people, we need to empower the United Nations to go and take collective action. Last December, there was a conference in Montreal, Canada, which the Chinese and the Americans cooperated very closely, and they decided to do whatever they can to protect living organisms and reverse the trend of extinction by the year 2030. And this treaty, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, has a goal of protecting 30% of the oceans or 30% of the high seas by the year of 2030 by establishing marine protected areas. Remember, I showed you the Antarctica and said, look at Ross Sea. Ross Sea is a huge marine protected area. That's the biggest we have now, which no country can go there illegally and take resources, and you know, it's like illegal. And luckily countries like the United States have satellite technology and they know who's there. But that's a huge one. It's about 600 square miles. But there are about 16,000 other marine protected areas all over the water, the oceans, the high seas. However, only 1.2% are legally protected. Nobody has paid attention. And for 28 years, nobody could do it until we reached this agreement. So it is really a blessing. It is really encouraging. It is hopeful. And if I may say so, one cannot live without hope. Thank you, Kay.
Okay. Thank you, Jay. I have a couple things I want to point out in chat. I sent out a link to the High Seas Alliance organization, and it has a running thing of the treaty ratification and things that you can do to encourage governments to ratify this. It gives a countdown. There's like, I think 226 days to go to get this ratified. And so far there's 14 countries and they need 60 to get that ratified. So there's a link there that you can click on. Also, I put the Time article that you mentioned you wanted to have read.
Okay.
Trouble in Paradise, that's from the July 15th, 2024 Time magazine. And let's see. So far we have one question. Let's look at this one. We hear more about the political issues of contention with the UN, including control by autocratic regimes and issues of support of terrorists. How can we make the constructive work of the UN more aware and separate from the political nonsense? What is this? And secondly, what is the status of world agreements regarding polar waters? Is that separate from the high seas? I understand there's a lot of conflict over control of those areas.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, as you know, the United Nations was formed in 1945 thanks to the efforts of President Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. And I may say so, mostly encouraged by his wife, Eleanor. She was the power behind
So we were talking about status of world agreements regarding polar waters.
I'm sorry,
Polar?
polar waters? Yes, yes, polar waters are considered part of the oceans, part of the high seas, even though they are under the ice, except where there is proven to be land under the ice.
Okay. And then in terms of, you were talking about Eleanor Roosevelt being a driving force with Theodore Roosevelt in terms of making, or Franklin Roosevelt, sorry, the United Nations.
Oh, the political stuff. Well, United Nations is really, we hear so much about the political disputes brought before the United Nations, war and peace and territorial disputes, ideological problems. The United Nations was designed to have separate departments. The General Assembly represents all countries. That 193 countries, each has one vote. Now, some people don't like that. They say, why should China with 1.4 billion people or India with 1.4 billion people have one vote, and then Seychelles Islands or Vatican or let's say Andorra with much smaller population to have one vote. But something had to be done. Now, the United Nations has a Security Council that usually deals with the issues of security, war, peace, decides to send peacekeeping forces. And that's what we hear on the news so much, disagreements between Russian leaders and American leaders and Chinese leaders. But that's only part. Most of the United Nations work is regarding for example, the World Food Program. They feed millions of people around the world, not just refugees and poor people, but even people who are working people in less developed countries. Then the vaccination, millions of people have been saved by the United Nations just in the last 4 years through vaccination by World Health Organization, which is a part of the UN. And then the UN has all these humanitarian, International Monetary Fund, World Bank are also part of the United Nations. They loan money to developing countries and less advanced countries to start businesses, to build schools, to develop infrastructure. So the United Nations is a complex organization and is getting even more and more complex because of the need. However, there are some people in the United States or some people in Iran or some people in Russia who want to control the United Nations. They don't want it to be independent. They don't want it to be a collective organization. And some of the great powers do that. The United States is the richest country in the world by far. It has the biggest military. Let me just tell you one thing that I just checked on. Do you know what the national income, national gross domestic product of Russia is last year? Little over 2 trillion. Do you know what the gross domestic product of the United States was? 25 trillion. That's the difference. So, of course, 2 trillion buys a lot more in Russia because things are cheaper for there. Let's say a dollar can buy one banana at Holiday gas station in Minnesota, but $1 can buy 4 bananas in Moscow. And the same is true in China. China, with 4 times more of a population than the United States. Okay, United States has what, 340 million? China has 1.4 billion. The gross domestic product, which means the total value of all the goods and services produced by China about a year ago, was about 17 trillion. China is catching up with the United States because of their size and development. And let me remind you, If I remember when President Nixon in 1972 announced that he was going to go to China and open up the doors for business, and animosities ended overnight because they were considered a communist country and adversary of the United States, President Nixon, with the support of the business leaders in the United States, opened up the doors, negotiated with Mao Zedong, the revolutionary leader of China. We went there because they had a big market for our products. And we also went there subsequent to that in the last, for 30, 40 years, because the labor was cheaper and they were good workers. So we took our factories there. I have friends who were executives of 3M, Seagate, almost all our major corporations took manufacturing operations to China because of cheaper labor. So we made huge profits out of China, and now they've learned everything from us. Management, technology, business practices. Now they don't want to be our child anymore. Now they want to be independent. So we got to learn how to deal with them. So the United Nations has a lot of services. If you just go online, put down United Nations humanitarian efforts. I personally have been very familiar with their United Nations High Commission for Refugees, because I've worked with refugees all my life.
Okay. Now I'm going to bring you back to specifics on the treaty. I had a bunch of questions on this. Does the treaty, what process does the treaty set out for resolving disputes between nations? Does it have any in terms of who or what polices how the high seas are treated? Like, if there ends up being conflicts then with somebody and one nation violating the treaty, how do you settle those disputes? I mean, does the treaty?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, if I may say so. But here's the situation. No law, no treaty is perfect, okay? The treaty establishes, the United Nations already has several organizations that are involved in monitoring and watching what's happening in the ocean. International Seabed Authority, for example, is charged with that. And then other organizations within the UN. And we have organizations in the United States. Every country has its own policing. You know, our Coast Guards, our Navy have really quite a bit of capability to watch what's going on. But this treaty is about 70 pages, 7-0. And I'm sorry, it's about 53 pages and 70 articles. So it talks about resolving disputes. However, if things get really bad, then countries can go to International Seabed Authority, or they can go at the final point, they can go to International Court of Justice. But let me tell you, United Nations is an association of government. United Nations itself as a whole is a treaty, which during World War II, President Roosevelt, his wife Eleanor, and others decided, okay, well, what are we going to do to reduce the incidence of war and bring people together to create understanding, to have a forum to resolve our disputes? Now, the disputes could be about war and peace. The disputes could be about protecting the ocean. So, but the United Nations does not have a police force, does not have a military. Every time the United Nations sends a peacekeeping operation to, let's say, a zone where there is war, the head of the United Nations or his representatives have to call every government. Let me tell you, our own Macalester College produced a graduate whose name was Kofi Annan. He became the Secretary General of the United Nations. He was originally from the country of Ghana in Africa. I had the pleasure of meeting him several times. And one time I helped him to come for a presentation at Macalester College. And he gave a speech, and somebody asked him, what's your greatest, it was toward the end of his 10-year term. And somebody asked him, what's your regret about all these years? What could you have done that you couldn't do, that really you regret about? He said, I couldn't prevent the genocide in Rwanda, which killed 800,000 people. And then he said, I couldn't prevent the war in Iraq in 2003. He really felt bad. And then he said, listen, I felt at that time of the Rwandan genocide, he was in charge of the peacekeeping forces. He wasn't Secretary General yet. This was in 1994. He was Deputy Secretary General in charge of peacekeeping. He said, I felt like a fireman with no trucks, no hoses, no firefighters. And every time there was a fire, like in this case, the fire was about to take place in Rwanda, I had to get on the phone, call every president, every prime minister, and that would take months because I didn't have a police force, a rapid deployment force. So I had to put a peacekeeping force together to send them to a war zone. So that is what we need to do with the UN, to empower it. And United Nations is an association of government, it's a treaty, so it doesn't have any power unless individual countries give it to it. And who are the ones who could do that? The major powers: United States, Russia, China, maybe to some extent India, West European countries. Unless we do that, United Nations treaties are meaningless.
Okay. The next question that was asked was, with more Arctic waters accessible due to climate change, since melt, I would say there's some more waters are accessible due to climate change. What, if any, action is being taken regarding access? I know the Ross Sea, you said, is highly protected, but...
Well, protecting oceans is related to protecting the whole environment of Earth, protecting the air, the waters that go into the oceans. Everything is related. All life is related. Now, the warming of the oceans has been found as a main cause of the hurricanes we are getting in Florida and Carolinas and other places, because the warming of the oceans is changing the whole pattern of Gulf Stream. So, and this is happening all over the world. They're getting cyclones and typhoons in the Far East. The question is, the sooner we reduce pollution from fossil fuels, we reduce global warming, and that will reduce the speed of the warming of the oceans. And the sooner we prevent the pollution, all the plastics that are falling in there, the more we protect the live organisms of the ocean. And they're really related. That's why the Montreal Agreement in December of 2022 established 2030 as the year by which we need to reverse the destruction and extinction of so many living organisms on Earth and the oceans. But this treaty, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, concentrates basically on the living organisms of the ocean. But as I said, that's not the only thing. For example, right now there is criminal activity going on in the Red Sea. There is criminal activity was happening for years off the coast of Somalia. And of course, the United States had the power and the means to go do something about it. But the United States is not everywhere, cannot police the whole world. And the United States is being now challenged by countries like China and Russia. So we need world cooperation. We need to have a system and empower that system to do, I'm sorry to say, the dirty work in order to get good results.
Okay, so I'm just going to differentiate. With the Arctic waters, is it North Pole, thinking North Pole, a lot of that is that over land in the North Pole, or is that opening up more waters up there with melt?
The North Pole is somewhat different than the South Pole.
Right, which is what I'm
The
thinking.
South Pole, as you saw on that globe map, is mostly water, but it's covered with huge chunks of ice. But North Pole, first of all, the Arctic Sea is relatively shallow, and scientists are concerned that it's drying out. Now, the warming is causing the ice to melt. Some of that ice is over land, some of it is over the Arctic Sea. So either way, and the danger of that is right now the countries that border the North Pole are even getting into territorial disputes and military positioning. For example, Russia is building a whole series of military bases on their northern border. And the United States is concerned about that, and China is concerned about that. China wants to have access to shipping through the so-called North Pole route. So we have to really cooperate at the international level. And I was going to say that, and I'm not only saying that, there is a gentleman, a professor at US Naval War College. His name is Paul Wills, and he's not a left-wing radical by any means. He's a military officer, naval officer, and he's also a professor of political science. And he has a quote that I saw recently that says, if you're going to be protecting the oceans or anything else, we got to be part of the process of the United Nations. Otherwise, we won't know what's going on. We don't know what the expectations of the world and other countries are. At least over there, we talk about things and try to find common solutions, even though it may take 30 years.
Okay, so let's see. Let's deal with, you talked about the Red Sea. How is that being addressed by the United Nations then, or not? What's happening there currently?
Well, the Red Sea is being dealt by several organs of the United Nations. First of all, on the international waters, on the part of the Red Sea, which is in the international waters, there should be free navigation. So the United Nations Security Council and others have condemned any attack on free shipping. But that's all they can do. They don't have a police force to go send over there to do anything. And if they want to send peacekeeping forces on ships to the Red Sea to prevent any attacks on Israeli ships or American ships or British ships, where are they going to get the ships? Who's going to give it to them? They have to borrow it from the United States. They have to borrow it from China. And actually, that's the problem with really enforcing this treaty about high seas, is that the rich nations, which have the money and technology and the ships and submarines, they can exploit the oceans whichever way they want. Whereas, what's Mongolia going to do? What's Cameroon in Africa going to do? They don't have the money, the military, the resources, the Navy. So obviously, United States of America is in the best position to take leadership. As I say, during World War II, after World War II, the United States took the leadership to create the UN, and now we are getting some people who are pushing the UN to the side. But have they offered anything better? Let me tell you one thing. After World War I, 1914 through 1918, some visionary Americans and Europeans proposed the creation of the League of Nations, which was supposed to bring the world together to prevent war and bring wars to an end. And it could not prevent World War II. But it took 20 years from World War I to become World War II. And 3 times more people were killed. Up to 60 million people perished as a result of World War II. The great majority were in Russia or Soviet Union at that time. But now, since 1945, when the UN was created and the United States developed the atomic weapons, we haven't had a World War III. Does anybody wonder why? Did the United Nations have something to do with it? Yes, we get to the United Nations and we yell and shout and condemn and sometimes, don't tell the truth about each other, but still it's a forum. I still would like to see President of Russia and President of the United States to send their emissaries to the United Nations to talk to the world and let the world decide. And then we need to respect that. We cannot say just because we are United States of America and we have the greatest military, we have to dominate the world. And the same with China. I don't want China or anyone to dominate. At least the United States is more democratic, where you and I can sit here and talk like that. But I don't want an autocratic government to really have much control over the world. So that's why we need a system of checks and balances. What's the greatest thing that came out of the American Revolution? American Declaration of Independence of 1776. And yes, these lands of America were colonies of Britain, England, which became Britain, which later became United Kingdom. But the greatest creation, which I would say was really ingenious on the part of the founding fathers. I wish there were some founding mothers too, but at that time it was basically founding fathers, was they create a system of checks and balances. They created an executive, the president. They created a judiciary. They created a Congress. These are supposed to create checks and balances. The United States Constitution even talks about the freedom of the press. The press is supposed to be free to check everybody else. Otherwise, the United States would have become an autocratic or dictatorial government. And sometimes I worry about that nowadays.
So what does the treaty require nations to do? What are the nations agreeing to do when they sign on?
Well, actually, the whole treaty is online. Just go put in there High Seas Treaty. And sometimes when you have insomnia like me, sit up till 4 o'clock in the morning and read it. But the treaty, again, the language is so important because for at least the last 10 years, hundreds of thousands of versions came up, but somebody disagreed with it. This prime minister, that president, or that government, because it was against their interest groups. Like, for example, the United States wants to have freedom to explore for resources. We need lithium right now for batteries, and we need to. What are we going to do when the big countries go exploit the ocean? That's why this treaty says no. The global south, the smaller countries, the so-called global south, which have not been as developed and as rich as the global north, also have a right to share that ocean, to protect it for food, for protection of the earth and our environment. So the treaty has provisions to really share power and share responsibility. Every country, even small country like Andorra in Europe, which they're landlocked, they don't even have access to any seas or ocean, but they have a right to have a clean ocean because it affects their air, it affects their food, it affects their livelihood.
Okay, so far 14 countries have ratified the treaty so far, and somebody's wondering what these 14 have in common that they would get it done already, while we're still waiting for 46 more to get it ratified. So I'm doing a quick write down of who has ratified it. So far it's Panama, Bangladesh, Barbados, Timor-Leste, the Maldives. I can never say that.
Maldives.
Thank you. I knew I was saying it wrong. Singapore, Cuba, the Federated States of Micronesia, and let's see, what else? Mauritius.
Mauritius.
Thank you. I'm gonna just butcher all of these names. The Seychelles. I did the Seychelles. I'm clicking through on the link that I sent out to everyone. Belize and Chile and Palau.
Palau. It's an island nation in the Pacific.
I might have missed one, but those are the 14 that have ratified at this point. And
well, you see a common pattern there, except for Bangladesh, which is a fairly large country as far as population, but economically, they are not really considered wealthy, and they don't have interest groups. They don't have companies that are going to go dig oil wells in the ocean or do large-scale fishing, even though they are on the edge of water and they get flooded every year or every other year, and hundreds of people die. So they have something at stake because the floods and hurricanes are affecting them. But many reasons. The smaller countries do not have so many interest groups as larger countries as the United States. Then there are countries like China, where the decision is made by a smaller group, the Politburo of the Communist Party. And in Russia, for example, President Putin basically gets his way. He has a few hundred people maybe agree with him, or a few thousand people, but the decision making is made by a smaller group. In the United States, we have a constitution which calls for consent by the Senate on foreign policy issues. And we have had laws passed since the formation of the US Constitution, which have made it even more difficult. And then you get the lobby groups. For example, the oil lobby or the lithium lobby or the solar panel lobby can get and say, no, we don't want any control. You know, we want to go get what we want everywhere. So you have to put up with all that. That's why it becomes more difficult. That's why you cannot really blame a senator or a president, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, because they cannot do whatever they believe. They cannot do whatever they want. They have to satisfy powerful interest groups, whether they are powerful because of membership, like labor unions, or whether they are powerful because they make so much money, like the oil lobby or the weapons lobby. So the people sitting in Washington have a process because they deal with that every day. I've worked with the staff of members of Congress for years as a citizen lobbyist, and they get bombarded by requests. I mean, I bet you on a daily basis, Senator Klobuchar or Senator Smith of Minnesota get well over 1,000 requests coming into their office about somebody wanting something. Somebody doesn't like something. I just heard, I have friends in those groups. Somebody said, oh, we don't like the light bulbs in St. Louis Park because they're too shiny. They're too powerful. So somebody says, oh, no, that's good because it prevents crime. Somebody says, no, it's bad because it damages the trees and shrubs. So you see, you have all these demands in a democratic society. That's why Winston Churchill, the World War II prime minister and leader of Britain, where really democracy in the form of a governmental democracy took roots, and then came to the United States because, you know, Americans learned so much of the common law and democratic practices from Britain. But Winston Churchill has a really interesting quote. He says, Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
So, are there any good organizations in the U.S. advocating Congress for this legislation?
Yes, you saw the lady from Pew Charitable Trust. All the environmental organizations, there is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, International Union for Conservation. They are made up of 14 different scientific conservation and environmental groups. All of them, Sierra Club, Environmental Justice Foundation. There are many. So just take your phone and put in there NGOs, non-governmental organizations advocating for the passage or ratification of High Seas Treaty, and you get a list.
Okay, someone's wondering what corporations, fossil fuels, cruise ships, these are people, who's most responsible for dumping garbage into our oceans?
Well, again, they're doing it right now, and this is proven by Coast Guard, by satellites of the US. How many countries have satellites? Maybe 24, and some of them are not that sophisticated, like India doesn't have as many satellites as the US, and the next to US is Russia and then China. And they're basically for military purposes, but they can see what's happening. But let's say a satellite identifies one ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, dumping tons of garbage and plastic, okay? They go to a landfill, they take the garbage, and they're paid. They're supposed to go get rid of it, but how do we know how they're getting rid of it? They'll go dump it in the middle of the ocean. That's why at Seychelles Islands, this article talks about finding plastic bottles manufactured in the US or India. They're finding evidence. And you know what they're doing at Seychelles Islands? These lower income people who are fisher people living just on subsistence living, you know what they're doing? They are burning the plastic bottles. There is no place to dump them. And the government of Seychelles doesn't let them throw back into the water because the winds bring them back. So they are burning plastics right next to their houses. Do you know the fumes? Oh my God, no wonder cancer rates, no wonder industrial poisoning is increasing. So that's one thing this treaty, well, we got to have laws, okay? For example, let's say we can criticize the UN and international organizations, but don't we have laws about stealing in this country? Every single country in the world has strict laws about stealing and shoplifting. Does that mean it prevents it? How many thieves there are in Minnesota today or last night? How many pieces of items were taken from stores by shoplifting? So just having laws on paper is not enough. You need to enforce them. So luckily, we have the police, we have the legal system, so the violators can be fined, taken before a judge. But at the international level, we don't have much of that. So each country has got to come in and say, okay, the US Coast Guard saw this ship, or the US satellite saw that ship dumping garbage. And so then they can find out where that ship was from. Unfortunately, these smugglers, often they don't have any signs or flags on their ship. And if they have it near the coast. But then they take it away. There was an example in Liberia a year ago or so. There was a Chinese ship doing what I call sweep fishing, where they have huge nets that sweep all the fish. Accidentally, they went into Liberian territorial waters, and the captain got arrested.
And then they said,
"Oh, sorry, we didn't know we were drifting into your waters." But what were they doing there? They were doing illegal fishing or unseasonal fishing. What does that do?
So, okay. And this is another thing. Someone's been receiving emails about protecting octopuses from farming for human consumption. does this legislation address like farming, or is it strictly within each country?
Well, let's just go back. This treaty, as of now, has a goal of protecting only 30% of the high seas and ocean by the year 2030. That's why, like, they're trying to set up a goal. That means the rest of the oceans, the 70%, can still be exploited by all kinds of people. They can go take the octopus, they can go take the dolphins. The question is that let's go a step at a time, because the world doesn't have the resources, and America does not want to pay its Coast Guard and Navy to go there check for thieves or smugglers who are stealing stuff from the ocean, because I mean, that takes money even for a wealthy country like the United States. But so it's like it's a step forward. And as I said, if you really look at it, to get an agreement from 193 governments of the world is itself unbelievable. Because usually at the Security Council, Russia wants one thing, Israel wants another thing, Palestinians want another thing, United States wants something else. So there's always this dispute, and therefore there is often inaction. But still, it's better than nothing. However, regarding the high seas, there is not as much contention, because I guess by common sense, most people say, oh, it's good to protect the oceans because it protects our food. We can make more money in the long run. That's why a lot of businesses in the United States were part of this formation. There was great participation, not just by NGOs and scientists and environmentalists, but representatives of big businesses. They said, oh yeah, we want to protect the ocean so we can make more money out of it in future, whether it's fisheries or keeping it clean or preventing rapid climate change. So
yeah, so the continental shelf aspect of the ocean is easier to protect, I'm sure, just because there's different impact on that part versus the deeper waters.
Yeah. Before 1982, the traditional accepted norm, there was no law, no rule, was that only 3 miles of the shore, of the water next to land of a country belonged to that country. The Convention on the Law of the Sea in 1982 said, no, that's not enough. Let's go to 12 miles, 12 nautical miles, which is slightly bigger, because countries should have a right to do fishing, drill for minerals. But of course, if it's their territory, they're more likely to protect it. We have environmental laws in this country. We have Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. Thanks to President Nixon, I remember when I was a student, he really pushed those things, and he was a conservative president. He was the one who set up the environmental, what's the name of it? Environmental Protection Agency. And so look what they've done. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had this good of a life.
So, well, that's the end of the questions that I have, and I see we're just a minute or two early. So I want to thank you. I mean, really, I hadn't been that aware of the high sea treaties before this came up, you coming on as a speaker. And so I'm just like so much more aware. I guess that's the thing I'm grateful for, and having that link to the High Sea Treaties organization to be able to follow the ratification now is going to be interesting. And we still have to put pressure on, because the US is not one of the ones. So we just want to thank you. We thank all of you for attending, and we are going to wrap this up. So thank everyone. We thank Grayson Simmons from Ollie, who's been helping with the technical difficulties. I thank Jay for coming in when his laptop quit and coming into the library and being able to get him on for you guys. Thank you.